Today is March 20th, 2018. My name is Debra Polsky, and I am the interviewer for the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. And today we're interviewing Martin Tobey about his life and his family. Welcome, Martin. Let's start out by telling us a little bit about your family history, and what you know about it.
Okay. Well, my grandparents on both sides were immigrants. On my maternal grandparents were Bernard Marcus and Nettie Fissler Marcus. They came from Jassy, Romania. They knew each other there and were engaged there, and wanted to come to America. It was no problem for my grandmother, but my grandfather was of the age to be inducted in the military, and that was a problem getting here. His half-brother was already in Dallas, Eli Smiley. They had the same mother but different fathers, so the different last names. And I think Uncle Eli was Smilovich when he came here and became Smiley, and I think my grandfather was Muscovitz and became Marcus. So Uncle Eli helped him get here, sent money, and worked on papers, some of which I doubt were strictly kosher, because, as I said, it was hard for him to leave the country. And I learned this when we went to see the movie The Counterfeit Trader, which was probably back in the 50s with William Holden. Mm-hmm. And I'd always thought of my grandparents as, quiet old people who were very nice to me. And they got very excited by this movie because the train stations they showed in Europe as William Holden as a spy traveled through Europe. They said, "Oh, we were there when we were leaving." And I'd never thought of this, and they told me the story. Apparently money changed hands to help Grandpa get out, and he said the conductor at one point put him in a compartment with a general and told the general, "This young man comes very highly recommended." I think he was probably recommended by a bribe. And he said it another time he got frightened because they acted like they were throwing him off the train. They threw him from car to car, mm-hmm. And what they were doing was they threw him back to the baggage car and back and hid him there while they went through some kind of checkpoint, I think on their way, I believe it was Hamburg where they set sail from. So for a young boy who was taken to the movies by his grandparents, that was quite a revelation that they had those adventures.
I bet. Were they able to leave together?
Yes. And
do you know what year it was?
About 1921. They were in New York for a while before coming to Dallas. They actually landed in Philadelphia because Ellis Island was closed for an epidemic. So actually none of my grandparents came through Ellis Island. Grandpa had been an embroiderer, apprenticed as an embroiderer in Romania. And they made the, you call them epaulets, mm-hmm. For the military uniforms, but that kind of thing went out of style. There wasn't that much call for embroidery, and so he became a dress designer and pattern maker in Dallas, and I think for a period of time, he and another gentleman had their own line of clothes, a Mr. Brooksailor. My grandmother was largely a housewife.
Right.
My other grandparents were Abraham Benjamin Tobolowsky. These are my paternal grandparents, and Lena Skybel Tobolowsky. They're really, I think, where all of us kind of date our family starting. But interestingly, my grandfather's father and grandmother were already here in Texas.
Really?
Yes, and the grandmother is buried, I think, in Sheriff Cemetery. Some of my cousins found it, and talks about her coming here because of pogroms in Europe, so they translated the Hebrew on the tombstone. His father, when I became of an age to be interested in these things, I asked some of my father's older brothers, and nobody really knew anything about him. He's buried here, but nobody really knows anything about him. His name was Jake. My grandmother, his grandmother may have been in Mineral Wells, I believe, or I think Mineral Wells for a while, but is buried in Dallas. Some of my other cousins may know for sure where she was in Texas. Why the first ones came to Texas, I couldn't tell you.
And that's typical that nobody knows why.
So, you know, where we have firsthand knowledge sort of starts with my grandfather, A.B., or people called him Uncle Ben or Abraham Benjamin. He told me in 1892, he said 400 years after Columbus is what he told me. He was, I think, around 13 at the time and came alone. He told me a story, it sounds perhaps a little far-fetched, but my Aunt Sarah said he told her the same story, so that's two sources, that he landed at the port of Galveston and took the train to Dallas to meet his dad. And he said at the time Dallas had 2 train stations, and he went to one and his father went to the other, so he was here not speaking English and no dad. And he said there was an Arab at the train station, and between the Hebrew and the Arabic, they could communicate enough that the Arab gentleman directed him to the other train station.
Oh, that's a great story.
So, I believe my grandmother probably came to the port of Galveston, Lena Skeibel. I don't know that for sure. She had 4 sisters, and then her mother died and her father remarried, and so they had 4 more girls, 4 half-sisters. I'm not sure if it was a sister or half-sister, Dora Goodman, we spoke with. She was the one remaining sibling, and said that the father had a lumber business in they were from Suwałki, Poland.
Okay.
My grandfather was from someplace called Tobolova, that I think is a stop sign in the road someplace, but that's where the Tobolowski came from. But she was from Suwałki, which apparently is a town of some size, and he had a lumber business, and Mrs. Goodman told us how he had Gentile workers, and they were fond of him because he would help them with saving their pay, and told us how they sawed the logs and floated them down the river. And I think the majority of the 8 girls, if not all of them, came to Dallas, and I've got a family tree someplace, but a lot of the families in Dallas from that era, Byers and Richovskis and Wiles and others were the married names of the sisters and half-sisters. Okay. So there are a lot of cousins of some closeness floating around Dallas through my grandmother's sisters and half-sisters.
So your grandmother was a Skeibel.
Yes.
And then, so I know that there was a Skeibel, that somebody's first wife was also a Tobolowski. Are you one of the cousins that's related on more than one side, or I think you're straight down the...
I think more than one side. There were a lot of branches on the family tree that didn't quite fork.
Right.
Limited sources of social life.
Right.
And there was also, Judy and I lived in Fort Worth for 35 years. There was a family, the Noodlemans, there that were from one of these sisters or half-sisters. My grandmother was a housewife. I would imagine a housewife extraordinary with 10 children, each of whom she catered to and cooked their favorite things, and cakes on Shabbos, I believe.
I think I also read that she was a midwife.
I don't believe so.
Maybe that's a different.
I don't believe so. Interestingly, there is a Skyble in Atlanta one of my cousins has been communicating with that I made him aware of. He wrote a piece in the New York Times Magazine, and I can get it for you if you're
That'd be
interested,
great.
about his trip back to Poland. They lost a brother in the Holocaust. There were some brothers too besides the sisters, I believe, and he wrote a piece in the New York Times Magazine.
Oh, yeah,
and,
that'd be wonderful.
And it turned out he was a relative. I saw the name and kept it, but my cousin David tracked it down, and we are indeed cousins. My grandfather was a peddler. They lived on Caroline Street, which is very close to where American Airlines Arena is now,
Right.
in the El Phoenix there. It was Little Mexico at the time, apropos that very nice exhibit that you all in the Hispanic Historical Society had. There were 10 children. I remember one of them saying that the parents spoke Yiddish initially, the neighbors spoke Spanish, the younger kids learned English from the older kids, and nobody knows where the older kids learned English. My grandparents spoke good English by the time I was there. But Grandpa Tobolowsky was a peddler, and I think he would leave on Sunday, and make the rounds of the country towns and get back on Thursday in time to get ready for Shabbos. So this 4 or 5 day route was through places where we commute to work from every day, Farmers Branch and Frisco, and places that we would consider
Right.
suburbs now were part of a country route at the time. And he brought piece goods out there from Dallas and brought back chickens, some of which were for the family and some of which he sold. I think one of his relatives was in the poultry business. He slept in the farmhouses with the farmers, ate with them. Uncle Dave, Paul Tobolowsky's dad, my Uncle Dave, remembers going with him on the route and sleeping on the ground with him.
Oh, really?
He had a horse and buggy when he started. My dad's remembrance said the horses were Rob and Maud, which somehow makes it personal. But I was driving in the car with my grandfather one time where Commerce Street meets Jackson, I believe. There's the KLIF building. It's kind of a Flatiron type building. And there was a fountain there, and he pointed out that fountain and told me he used to water his horses there. And
kidding.
I told that story to my brother and told him we should go by and look at it, and it wasn't there. And I called the Dallas Historical Society to see if this was a recovered memory, told him the story, and said, no, you were not making up that memory. It's in Heritage Village now. So that fountain has been moved to Dallas Heritage Village. And she sent me a bunch of papers about how the SPCA had bought the fountain, and it had a plaque saying it was for watering the dogs. There was a lower part for the dogs and an upper part for the horses. So he watered his horses in downtown Dallas at the time. And then later, he got a Model T Ford.
Right.
And did his route with that.
Do you know when they moved from Caroline Street?
I've got that someplace, not on the top of my head. Uncle Dave was mentioning it when we visited the other day. It was a 36 Pontiac, but I'm thinking it was in the early 40s. Mm-hmm. They moved a little later. They were very, very poor. And so they moved a little after the rest of the Jewish community, and then after the Jewish community moved to North Dallas, they had a little lag in moving there. On Caroline Street, it was a shotgun house, as some people call it. It had a front door and a back door with a hall in between, so you could open it in the summer and get a breeze, and then the rooms were to the side. And there were 10 children, and the two of them, two parents, so 12 people in this little house. The parents and the two girls slept in one of the front bedrooms. 4 boys in one bedroom, 2 boys in the other, and then my father Nathan and Uncle Dave slept in the dining room. They had a Murphy bed type thing. I asked Uncle Dave one time if it was true that they slept in the dining room. He said, no, that was not true. The family ate in his bedroom.
Oh.
And they took a bath on Saturday night, heated the water on the stove between each one, order of age, where I think that was kind of standard, because the phrase "don't throw out the baby with the bath water" came from that. But so the money was tight, and I remember one of Judy, my wife's cousins, hearing stories about this from my dad, and the cousin asked, "Were you very poor?" And my dad said, "We didn't know we were till somebody told us." They played baseball in the street. One of their neighbors made a little drawing of them playing baseball in the street, a little cartoon of it that we have.
Oh, I've seen something.
I sent it to
us, and I didn't realize that's what it was.
Yeah, that was playing baseball in the street on Caroline Street.
Gotcha.
And they made their own baseballs. We called them sock balls. We still made them when I was a kid because they were good for urban ball, not breaking windows. But when one of the adult men's socks were worn out, the big calf-length socks, they would stuff it with rags and then tie it, fold it over, and keep doing that till you ran out of socks, and then stitched it up. And
how clever.
So that's what you did when you didn't have money for a baseball. We played with those when I was a kid too, and I just threw one with that I had lying around with a couple of my grandsons last week. The boys sold newspapers. Am I straying too far from your questions?
No, absolutely not. That's great.
They sold newspapers on the corner of, I think it was Main and Lamar, either Main and Lamar or Elm and Lamar, by the Sanger brothers, which is, I think, now the community college. And they passed it down from brother to brother, including when they were in college and medical school and law school. Some of them kept selling papers. They initially, I think, bought them for 1/2 cent a piece and sold them for a cent, and then inflation hit somewhere along the line. It went up to 1 penny and 2 pennies. They would, I think, run them off from Sanger Brothers because they didn't want the employees reading the paper or pestering the customers, but I know they were outside of Sanger Brothers. And I remember riding downtown with my dad, and I was at that point a very dignified position. All of a sudden he rolled down the window and stuck his head out and yelled at a disreputable looking character who was somebody that was selling papers at the same time. I think Uncle Dave said they stuck together so that the competition wouldn't try and run them off their corner. It was a good corner.
Okay.
They sold magazines too. Uncle Easter, Peggy's dad, I remember one time showed us some ledgers they had with the dates and the papers they had.
Oh, really?
You know, and how much they had spent, how much they had taken in, you know, careful records every day that went into the family kitty.
So supporting the family was really a family affair.
Oh yes, it all went into the kitty, and then the older brothers, when they were adults and went off to work before they were married, still supported the family. Do you want me to talk about the brothers?
Talk a little bit about the brothers.
Okay. Well, and sisters, there were 10 of them. The eldest was Hyman, my Uncle Jaime. He was high school valedictorian, but was unable to go to college at that point, and went to work for Sanger Brothers and subsequently for E.M. Cans, which was across the street from Sanger Brothers. He would get some of his summer jobs when we were in high school there. Also, it was a men's clothing store. Sanger Brothers was the forerunners of Sanger Harris, which was the forerunner of Dillard's. All these were Jewish families, and I think the Cans and the Sangers were related by marriage. I remember there was a Eugene Can Sanger at the time I was working there, so the families were related. Uncle Meyer and Uncle Sam also worked at Sanger's. Sam subsequently became an accountant for the Dallas Bar Association and the Chamber of Commerce for probably 40 years, I'm sure. He retired at 80 from being the Chamber of Commerce and Bar Association's attorney.
Wow.
And Meyer worked for Sanger's for many years and then opened a piece goods store, I guess you would call it, materials on Oak Lawn. Around Lovers. It was called the Yardstick and had a neon sign of a yardstick. Jaime's wife was Hermine Dalkowitz Stabolowski, who I'm sure is well documented here
Right.
as mother of women's equal rights in Texas. Jake was a merchant, I think probably a manufacturer's representative. I don't believe he ever worked at Sanger's. So those, I guess, were the four that didn't go to college, the four oldest. Sarah may have been next, and she, all of them that went to college went to SMU, and then I think she got
really?
a graduate degree from Columbia, and she was a school librarian, and in fact, Judy and my school librarian at Benjamin Franklin when we came along.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, and very warm woman, very extremely proficient. She was, I think, president of the National or International School Librarians Association. And Easter was an attorney, SMU and SMU Law School. I may be getting my orders scrambled. Sylvan was also an attorney. again, SMU and SMU Law School, and then he went to Washington and worked for the Internal Revenue Service for 10 years.
Okay.
And with the knowledge he gained, he came back to Dallas and was one of the first tax attorneys in Dallas.
Wow.
And a story I heard from Ira Tobolowsky, who was also an attorney, was that when they had a case, here Uncle Sylvan would be on one side and the IRS on the other, obviously, and the attorneys from the IRS would come in and say, Mr. Tobolowsky, what's the law on this and what's the right thing to do here? He was so respected that the other side just said, you tell us the law and how it should work out.
That's wonderful.
And then my dad and Uncle Dave were physicians. Again, both went to SMU. And Dad went to Baylor Medical College when it was in Dallas, and then it moved to Houston. Uncle Dave started at Baylor and ended at Southwestern. Half the faculty went to Houston and continued Baylor, and half stayed and started Southwestern.
Oh, that's interesting. I never knew that's how it started.
Yes. And it still was the Baylor College of Dentistry. Here it was a remnant of that. I don't think it's Baylor anymore. It's Texas A&M or somebody else. And then Miriam was the baby. She was the only one who left Dallas, moved to Los Angeles. Sadly just passed away in the past week.
Oh, yes.
Very bright, articulate, independent woman, was a joy to talk to. She had a career teaching school, everything from kindergarten through high school. And then after that, she was a real anti-MAME in her travels all over, and she went into the wilds of every place by herself. And she started running a travel magazine. I guess today it would be a blog, but it was a print magazine then. I guess other cousins will speak of their parents.
Tell me about your parents.
Since we're talking about that side, I haven't come to my mom's side yet. I'll talk about my dad. He was, as I said, a physician and a surgeon, a very interesting, thoughtful individual. He was always fixing, always organizing. There was nothing he couldn't fix or didn't try to, and the same thing with people, both medically and his dentist told me how he talked to him about how he was working too hard and he needed to get a hobby and take up golf, so he was there to advise and help everybody. He was a medical, in the medical division that fought aircraft for a lot of years, was part of his practice, and he became medical director of it. And I would encounter people who remembered him from Vaught and remembered him setting up ambulance systems and things if somebody was hurt on the job to how they could get to medical attention quickly. So he was always organizing and fixing. He never forgot the upbringing. All the brothers and sisters were very close, and of course very frugal with that upbringing, you know, fix it yourself, and he did. Interesting story was his getting into medical school. And subsequently, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in medicine back in the 40s and 50s when he was getting started. And he told me he knew if he could get into medical school, he would do just fine, but it was going to be problematic as a Jew getting in. And at Sanger Brothers, the president, I don't know if his title was president or CEO then, but it was a gentleman named Mr. Simmons, who himself was Catholic, not Jewish. And I think he remembered him selling papers, and he was very fond of Jaime and Meyer and Sam that worked there. Mm-hmm. And he was on the board of directors of Baylor Medical College, and what my dad said was he told him, "This is one Jew that you'll take." So he remembered the family with fondness, and went out his way to make sure that Dad was fairly received in the application process.
Mm-hmm. Now, was this, your dad served in the Army?
Yes.
Is that right? So did he, which came first? Medical school? Or?
Medical school. If we're talking about anti-Semitism in the era, and I guess it's something we should, my father was just one of the smartest people I ever met, and I had professors who were Nobel laureates. I mean, he was smart. But he flunked his surgery boards twice. And that's because they had oral examinations, and he went down to New Orleans to take them, and he said he was supposed to, it was supposed to be anonymous. You were just supposed to have a candidate number, and he said he walked in, and the examiner said, "You're Dr. Tobolowsky from Dallas," and he knew he was in trouble, and he went down there twice and didn't pass twice. And Dr. Billy Aronoff, who was a surgeon in Dallas that was older than he, took my dad aside and said, "You'll never pass as long as you go to New Orleans. Go to Kansas City and you'll get a fair hearing." So he went to Kansas City and took his oral examination and passed. So there was some blatant anti-Semitism in the medical profession back then.
That's really something.
He was in the Army Medical Corps during World War II. Mm-hmm. He didn't go overseas. He went with the troops. I think they were bringing him from the East Coast to the West Coast, or vice versa, so he followed the troops across until they were deployed overseas. Mm-hmm. and then would make the run. He met and married my mother during that time.
And how did they meet?
In Dallas. She and his sister Miriam were friends. Oh. And they met through Miriam. Miriam, I think, said she stole her adored brother from her. So I guess that's a good segue to talk about my mom's family. I mentioned my grandma and grandpa. My mom was Rose Marcus. She went to Forest High School. Lived on Driscoll Street, which was South Dallas. And was valedictorian, went to SMU, and then I think she had a graduate degree in social work. Do you remember where that was from, Judy? Yeah, Judy, and I think it's Tulane. Judy also has a master's in social work from Tulane. And she worked for a short time until she got married. And I think went to the bases along the South, though, with my dad some of the time, and some of the time they just corresponded. I have some letters that they sent back and forth. And through the period of my growing up, she was a housewife. Your Ozzie and Harriet 50s housewife, right. Then mother for Cub Scouts, room mother. I think a little after that she was president of Temple Emmanuel Sisterhood. And her career kind of blossomed after my brother and sister and I were grown. She was developed as an artist, and a very fine one. some local reputation. I think she had shows at Edith Baker's galleries. And a very interesting mind in her art. She started kind of learning doing different people's styles. There was an impressionistic and so forth, and abstract, but her ultimate style she called bag lady art. She made art and constructions from found objects, and they're very witty. And my siblings and cousins and I still have her art. When people come over to our house, they really enjoy seeing it, speak very favorably of it. She had one sibling, a sister, Beatrice, whom we all know as Biddy. She said if possible, Biddy made even better grades than she did. Went to SMU where she was all everything, and married a medical student at Southwestern, Larry Gladstone, who was a Holocaust survivor. Biddy was 10 years younger than my mother, but Larry was their age. He lost 10 years in the war and its aftermath. I think was in displaced persons camp, and then found by relatives of his that were in New Mexico, and he and Biddy eventually settled in El Paso, where she was very active in Jewish activities. So,
how were your parents or your family involved in the Jewish community? You said your mother was president of Emmanuel Sisterhood.
Right.
Were there other organizations or congregations that they were involved in?
We initially were at Tiferet Israel, as was all of my father's family, and about half the family stayed there, and about half went to Temple Emmanuel. And
do you know why?
Yes, my Uncle Jaime was the first one that broke off and went to Temple Emmanuel. When he married Aunt Hermine, they were not going to sit separately in the synagogue. And so they were the first ones. And then I think for several of the branches, reform was more fitting the temperament and lifestyle. And there was I think at that time, a great desire to assimilate also, hence changing our name from Polsky to Tobey. So we started at Tiferet and then went to Temple. And I remember when my grandparents still lived in South Dallas, I can remember South Boulevard, but walking from one congregation to another, at the time Temple wasn't in the mix, but I believe the synagogues here originally were more by country of origin than denomination. So
yeah, I think you're right.
Tiferet was the Russian-Polish one, which my family, the Tobolowskis, were in, and Grandpa Marcus, Shemini Azeret, does that sound familiar?
Shemini Atzeret?
Yes, I think that was the Romanian one.
Oh, Anshe Spard.
Okay.
Anshe Spard, the Romana Shishul.
Yes, so we would walk from one to the other on high holidays to see my two sets of grandparents there. And I remember the house on South Boulevard. My grandmother would always greet us with, "Welcome, Sweetula, have a cookie." And there was always stewed chicken on the stove. I can still smell it. The Marcuses lived on after Driscoll on South Ridge in Lakewood.
Oh.
I remember spending the night there when my brother was born. So those were really the affiliations.
What do you remember about holidays, celebrating holidays? I mean, obviously, you had these two different sets of grandparents, and how did your family celebrate Passover and the high holidays and things like that?
Well, initially with very long seders at some of the Tobolowskis, and then briefer seders with more English as time went on, and Temple was more in the picture. high holidays, we would always not go to school, and I think we would go to temple in the morning, and in the afternoon play touch football on the wall.
Do you remember any special foods or dishes that your mother would make, or your grandmothers, that were sort of, traditional family recipes?
They made gefilte fish from scratch.
Really?
Yes, and Judy has the recipe, and once a year rolls up her sleeves and makes me that, because that's a treasured childhood memory. And their matzo ball recipes as well. The gefilte fish was Romanian style, which had some grated carrot in it, which I think most gefilte fish doesn't, but that sweetens it, and it's really good. Both of my grandmothers made Hummentaschen. Grandmother Tobolowski's had the tastier crust, but she filled them with poppy seeds, which was like eating sand. Just a wonderful crust, but a sand filling. Grandmother Marcus, the crust wasn't quite as moist, but the filling was wonderful.
That's funny. So you belonged to both, originally to Farrad and then to Emmanuel. Do you remember religious school?
Oh, yes.
Going to religious school and confirmation, bar mitzvah, any of that?
Yes. I was a rebellious student, I will say, and played hooky from Sunday school for a year, but contrite, I came back and then went through confirmation class with Rabbi Olin, and that really, I enjoyed that. I enjoyed him very much, and one time he called me doctor after an answer, which filled me with pride.
Oh, I'm sure, I'm sure.
And Rabbi Klein was there at the time, and he was a very fine pastoral rabbi. He was the one that married us. Yeah, Judy and I were married in Temple.
Oh, okay. So, were there any other organizations that your parents belonged to, during that time period, whether it had to do with Israel or just the community itself?
Not that I remember so much. Not that I remember so much.
So, here you're growing up. What did you do? Where did you went to Franklin?
Yes.
For middle school, obviously. And what about after that?
Hillcrest High School. And then I went to college at Penn State because they had a combined program where you combined your undergraduate and medical school, went to school summers and got out a couple of years sooner. And so medical school was at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, which sounded like a good idea in the time, but the years I saved managed to get me out in time that there was still a draft. So,
is that right?
So I went in the Army instead of an extra couple of years of college.
You did. And where did you serve?
I was in the medical corps. I went in after my residency, and I was at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. I was probably one of the few people that was in, well, Vietnam had really come to an end. There were still some Americans there, but I think the war was officially over. But I had a really nice Army experience. I was newly married. It wasn't working day and night like residency had been, so we were on the East Coast, and we had two cars on their second engines, not a nickel to rub together, but we drove all up and down the East Coast, seeing the country when I had leave.
Yeah, the advantages of being in some place where other cities are only a few hours away instead of all the way across.
Right. We were between Philadelphia and D.C., so.
Yeah. So after the Army, then what?
I came back to Southwestern and did a fellowship in cardiology, and then went into practice in cardiology in Fort Worth, where I lived and worked for 35 years.
Okay, let me back up just for a minute.
Sure.
How did you and Judy meet?
A mutual friend set us up. We were at Hillcrest High School. She was a year behind me, but we didn't know each other in high school. And so after college, after her graduate school, after my medical school, and I was doing a residency all those years later, a friend, I talked to a friend and said, I'm not going with anybody now. Do you know anybody I could call up? And she said, well, Judy Ross is in town. So that's how we met.
Oh, great. And tell me a little bit about your family.
Well, Judy and I, Judy background is in social work. She went to several colleges, transferred, but graduated from University of Texas, and then went on to Tulane School of Social Work for her master's degree. She went on a full scholarship from the National Institute of Mental Health.
Wow.
And studied school social work, and she was working as a social worker when I met her. She was a mother for the years that our children were growing up, and has been very active in volunteerism. She's was president of the Fort Worth Friends of the Library, and currently is a vice president of the Dallas Symphony Orchestra Guild.
Oh,
So
wow.
she's been very active in community things. In recent years, she's been working as a college counselor, helping students choose colleges, apply to colleges, select their areas, and so forth. We have two children. Our oldest is Danny. Danny went to Pascal High School in Fort Worth, and then Harvard undergraduate, Yale Law School, and then Southwestern Medical School. So he has a law and a medical degree. He works as an attorney, though.
Here in Dallas?
Here in Dallas. He has published a novel and is working on a second one.
It was wonderful. I read it.
Oh. So he's done several things. He actually, I think along the way, while he was in law school, started a software company for some legal software and sold the company. So he's done a number of things. He's given me three three wonderful grandchildren. I should mention his wife is also a Judith Tobey. She's from Boston, the Boston area. She went to Harvard undergraduate and Yale Law School also, and they met and married in law school. And they have three wonderful kids. Nathan, after my dad, is 7 currently, and then they have 2-year-old twins, Alexander, Alex, and Mira is my only granddaughter. She's Miriam after Judy's mom, and Rose after my mom.
Oh,
So
okay.
she's Miriam Rose Tobey. My daughter Rachel is a physician. She's an internist here in Dallas, currently taking a little maternity leave. She went to Country Day School in Fort Worth, and then she went to Harvard undergraduate, taught school for a while, and then went back to University of Pennsylvania Medical School. And as I said, she does internal medicine. Her husband is Steve Walsh. He's from Toronto, and they met when she was doing a residency in San Francisco. They were introduced by mutual friends. He's from Toronto. He has a MBA from Stanford, but he was currently living in El Salvador, working in the administration of the TACA Airlines, which is El Salvador. So she told us she was going out with a fellow from El Salvador. And because he worked for the airlines, he could fly on the weekends. So she moved from San Francisco back to Dallas. And so he would fly up every weekend until things, excuse me, took, and he moved to Dallas, and he works as a consultant in Dallas. And they have two wonderful little boys. Eli is 3, and Aaron is 2. So with 2 of them 15 months apart, that's why she's on maternity
Yes, I'm sure.
leave right now.
I'm sure. She had 5 grandchildren, but only 1 girl.
Only 1 girl.
I suspect she's a little spoiled.
Oh, she's adorable in those.
That's good. That's good. Talk to me a little bit about what it was like being part of such a big family. I mean, did you realize that your family was big and sort of spread out, and as opposed to maybe your friends who had smaller, more intimate
I think we
relationships?
did. My father's siblings were very, very close, which I think when you grew up with 12 of you in a tiny house, either you become very close or probably have to get away, one or the other. But they were very close, and so their children, my cousins and I, were very, very close. And I have extremely fond memories of both South Boulevard and Orchid Lane when they moved to North Dallas, of the cousins getting together on weekends over at my grandparents' house, and for holidays like Passover too. So the subsequent generations were very close, and I'm happy to say that our children have remained very close. And for instance, Paul's son Andrew, who's a professor of, I think, Jewish Studies and Religion in William and Mary College. Whenever he comes to town, he always gets all the cousins together and so forth. So it's a very tight-knit family, a lot of warmth.
That's great. That's really wonderful. What would you say was the impact of your collective family on the community, either the Jewish community or the general community, just in general, looking at so many different personalities and occupations?
Well, I think they had a real mark on the professional life in the city. As I mentioned, on my dad's side, there were doctors and lawyers, and I think Easter was probably active in the Bar Association. Sylvan, likewise, I think was well known. I'll still meet attorneys who remember them. The merchants, you'll meet people who remember them. My dad, I neglected to say, was on the clinical faculty at Southwestern, and he taught anatomy at Baylor Dental College, and until just recently, almost every dentist would see our name and say, "Oh, were you related to Nathan? He taught me anatomy," and they all had stories. In Fort Worth, I knew a dentist named I believe it was Dr. O'Brien. He was an All-American basketball player at TCU, and he said there was something they were all struggling with in anatomy, and my dad showed him how it all worked and what it all was. And then somebody, O'Neill. Somebody came up to my dad and asked him the same question. He said, "Ask O'Neill, he understands it." So they all had stories, and all, most of the dentists in town probably went to Baylor. They all remembered him.
So they really had an impact on their professional
Yes.
communities.
And Sarah, of course, with the schools for the Dallas ISD.
Are you following in their footsteps, would you say?
Well, I try and be active in the community. I'm doing some volunteer teaching at Southwestern, and some volunteering in some of the arts groups here, like the Symphony Orchestra Guild and the Puccini Society. So medical and arts, I am a little bit involved.
Making your impact on the community. Who would you say was your role model? Were your role models?
Oh, I think my parents.
Anything in particular about how they lived that?
Just the vigor with which they approached life. They didn't do things halfway. Anything they tackled, they studied it, they learned it, they did it full on, whether it was my dad in medicine or my mom in art. And I think the integrity with which they approach things.
One last question. What would you like your personal legacy to be? If you had to leave a message for your currently 5 grandchildren and maybe the generations that come after, what would you like to say to them?
Oh, I think I just want to be remembered with affection by them.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to add? Anything we didn't cover?
Do you want to talk about anything about growing up in Dallas in the 50s?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. What was that like? Where exactly did you grow up?
Well, at age 3, we moved. I moved with the family to Lupton Drive, which is near the intersection of Walnut Hill and Hillcrest.
Oh, so you were in North Dallas already?
Yes.
Or what became North Dallas eventually. And what was your neighborhood like? What do you remember about that time?
Oh, it was I think a much simpler time with much more freedom for children. Rode my bike every place, played in the drainage ditches under Walnut Hill Lane. I can't imagine my daughter or my daughter-in-law letting their children go wild like that. Dallas was a much smaller town, a much smaller city in that time, much less urban and congested, and children were given more latitude. My cousin Paul and I would meet downtown. We would take the bus. Or if we went to Fair Park on fair day from the schools, we'd take the bus and transfer downtown and do all that ourselves probably when we were 10 years old. Downtown Dallas was a smaller place. We would go and listen to records on the headphones at the library. We would go to Douglas Magic Land and watch the people demonstrate magic tricks. We would eat at the Orange Inn, where you'd get a hot dog and an orange soda out of a fountain in downtown Dallas. Or has anybody in your interviews ever mentioned Shanghai Jimmy's chili rice?
No, that's not one I've heard before.
Oh, that was in downtown Dallas. Shanghai Jimmy was some kind of local character who would run it for a couple of years and then disappear for a couple of years. And he would mix chili and rice, and he had all his kinds. You could get cheese in it, not kosher, or butter in it, which was certainly good for the cholesterol, or onions in it. And his claim to fame was Elvis would eat chili rice when he'd come to town. So I'm sure if we Googled it, we could still find Shanghai Jimmy's chili rice. So downtown was more a center of things, but everything was smaller and simpler.
So by then, most of the Jews were moving away from South Dallas.
Oh, yes.
And had moved north.
Oh, yes.
Already.
Like I said, I think mine, well, I can remember moving from South Dallas to North Dallas, but yeah, they were always later in their move than everybody else, so I think by the 50s, most of the Jews were probably in North Dallas.
Right. What do you remember about high school? You were right in the neighborhood, right?
Yeah, we would ride our bike or walk to high school. I don't think anybody walks to school anymore, maybe a few. Just the classes, the football games.
If I heard correctly, I understand that Hillcrest was also sort of known as Hebrew High.
Yes.
At that point. What was that like?
Well, it wasn't like the Northeast, what would you say, 10, 20% of the school Jewish? It wasn't one of these like the high schools I saw in Philadelphia when I went to a school there where they'd be 80% Jewish. It was probably 20% Jewish, and that was enough to earn it that accord in those days. And then Thomas Jefferson was probably second in terms of the number of Jewish kids. It was a small Jewish community then, not like now, and probably 25 families, that kind of everybody knew everybody.
And in your case, probably related to many of them.
Quite a few, yes.
That must have been something. I've heard these apocryphal stories about kips.
Oh, yes.
Tell me what that was like.
Kip's was a big boy hamburger. It was across the street from Temple Emmanuel. I won't tell you that anybody ever snuck out of Temple and went over to Kip's, but it was home of the big boy, which was 2 patties and special sauce.
Right. I've heard that was quite the meeting place for Jewish kids back then.
And then there was a place in Preston Royal called Sally B's, which probably had a dozen kinds of sundaes with ice cream and sauces piled high. It was, like your 50s movies about America. Of course, part of the reason it was such an idyllic time was we lived in a very segregated world. Our high schools were segregated. I don't think we had any clue of the disparity of incomes that existed in Dallas, or the poverty was here. So, when you lived in a bubble, it was kind of easier for it to be an idyllic time.
When did you graduate from high school?
65.
So that was
before they were
and
integrated.
Dallas was pretty late to integration anyway. So
I think the Dallas of those days was not as progressive as it is now. I think they probably did everything they could to delay it and do tricks with busing and things to avoid it. But it was probably integrated by the time my brother and sister got there.
Yeah. Do you remember, just in general, that segregation? I grew up in the deeper South, so I remember, white water fountains and colored.
Yes.
Remember any of that?
I very well remember white and colored. They were labeled restrooms and water fountains when we were growing up at places like Fair Park. And one of Judy's high school classmates that she reconnected with recently told her a wonderful story that she moved here from the north, and when she saw this, she ran over to the colored water fountain to drink. She told her friend she wanted to see the colored water. She didn't realize what this was, but oh yes, I remember the separate facilities.
Do you remember your family ever talking about it, or an awareness of that kind of thing?
I don't think it was on the radar. It wasn't that people didn't have a social conscience, but for years the Hutus and the Tutsis were decimating each other, and who knew? It wasn't on the news, you know, you just didn't know about it. It was, I think people didn't even think about it. It was really more by when I got to college age that these things, obviously in the 60s, really started to come to the fore, and we realized the disparity and the unfairness of it.
Well, it sounds like you had a lovely childhood.
Oh, it was very
growing
nice.
up in North Dallas, and a lovely family as well.
I forgot, I just alluded to my brother. My brother and sister were 9 and 11 years
Yes, you
younger
didn't
than
really
I.
talk about,
Yeah.
about either of them.
Well, Robert is an attorney here in Dallas, my brother, and he's actually, I think, vice president of the Dallas Bar Association.
Oh, okay.
Has practiced law here for many years. My sister Rena lives in New York City, and she's an art historian. She's teaching a course at the 92nd Street Y this semester.
Any last thoughts you'd like to give us about your family?
I think those are all the memories. Glad we got them before they're gone.
They're very good ones. We really appreciate it. This project is designed to capture just that, the memories that people have of their own lives and the world around them. And we really thank you so much for participating.
My pleasure.